SolidStart is a meta web framework for building full-stack applications with both JavaScript and TypeScript, and it's built on top of the front-end framework SolidJS. Now, SolidStart just reached version 1.0 a few weeks ago, and in this video, we're going to take a look at it, but we're going to take a look at it from the perspective of a React developer. So I've implemented a few apps in both SolidJS and React, and also in SolidStart and Next.js, and we're going to compare and contrast how things are done in all of these. So we're going to look at things like state management, conditional rendering, list rendering, component updates. We're also going to take a look at meta framework features like file-based routing, data loading, client-side rendering versus server-side rendering, and everything in between. We'll also try to look at things from the lens of the world of JavaScript and what's to come for meta frameworks. So let's get into it. My name is TJ. Welcome to Syntax. So a few weeks ago, Ryan Carniato, the creator and maintainer of SolidJS, gave a talk at DevWorld called The Shape of Frameworks to Come, and also released this blog post that kind of details how SolidStart works and basically announced that it is in 1.0. So that means there aren't going to be any more breaking changes. You can trust that if you decide to use SolidStart for your application, you will not run into breaking changes anytime soon. But if you haven't seen the talk, I highly recommend you check it out. Also check out the blog post that kind of details how SolidStart works, why it exists. They talk about how they do file routing. They talk about how they do data loading and streaming, and really just their perspective on this meta framework thing. So yeah, like I said, check that stuff out. But before we dive into SolidStart and look and see how it works, we should take a look at SolidJS first, because SolidJS is a front-end framework that SolidStart is built on top of. So SolidJS is to SolidStart as React is to Next.js. So we're going to take a look at how SolidJS works. And I know what you might be thinking, not another front-end framework, but this is a good one, trust me. And if you're a React developer, you especially will like it, I think. It has over 30,000 GitHub stars. It's been around for over 5 years. It's not just some new JavaScript framework. It's been around for a while. They know what they're doing. And if you're a React dev, it's going to look very familiar. So this is your first look at a SolidJS component. At first glance, it looks like React, but there are some differences here in that we're using signals instead of state. And we have a set interval at the top level. You would never do this inside of a React component because React re-renders every time there's a state update, and then this interval would get redefined. You'd have to put this inside of a use effect. There are some differences in how it's actually working under the hood. And if you take a look at their homepage, they actually have some benchmarks here. Now, of course, you can't trust every benchmark, but it is interesting to see that SolidJS is only slightly slower than Vanilla.js. And that's because whenever you compile and build a SolidJS application to run in the web browser, there is no runtime. There is no virtual DOM. Basically, the code that you write here gets compiled into highly optimized vanilla JavaScript. And so that's why it can be so fast compared to these other front-end frameworks. And that's why it's interesting to look at, because if you can write an app like this, the build process kind of takes care of a lot of the optimizations for you. You don't have to worry about re-renders and virtual DOM updates. You write your code like this, and then when you build it, it is as small as possible, so you have a really small bundle size, and it's also really fast because you don't have a runtime, you don't have the virtual DOM. So it's definitely interesting to check out. Let's take a look at an app that I built with both React and SolidJS. So this is an image search application. Essentially, what you can do is type in a search term, it will hit an API, get back the response, and then lazy load these images onto the page. So you can see as I scroll, we actually have a gray box that takes up the full resolution of where that image will load into. It then loads a low resolution and then loads a high resolution image on top of it. So this is a custom image loading component. And we're going to look at this implemented both in React and then also in SolidJS. So the app works exactly the same over here. Enter the search term, hit the API, get back the images, and then lazy load them as they come into view. So if we look at the React code for this, it's pretty straightforward. We have a loading state variable that starts off as false. We have an images array that starts off as an empty array. And then we have a little form here. So when this form is submitted, we clear out the images, set loading to true, grab that search term from the form, call our API, that's what this function does here, set the images on state, and then set loading to false. So pretty straightforward. If you look at the SolidJS implementation, it's very similar, except we're using signals instead. So we have our loading and images signals. We also have the exact same submit function. It's exactly the same except for the type defined for the event here. And then we bind submit there to the onSubmit function of the form. So far, solid and React, fairly similar. But where things start to differ is the use of these state variables. So here in React.js, you can see for this loading image, we're actually just taking a look at that loading variable. If it's true, we're going to render out this image. If it's not true, we're not going to render out the image. If we look at the SolidJS implementation, SolidJS has this declarative show component. So instead of having like a ternary or an inline expression there, we have show, and there are a couple of props. So this says when loading is true, render out this image. Show also has a fallback option, so you can decide what to show when this is false. And you'll notice to access this signal, we actually need to invoke it. So if we take a look here, this is actually an accessor or a getter for this state variable. So this is the one thing that's going to take some getting used to when you're looking at solid code, is anywhere we're accessing these signals, they actually need to be invoked instead of directly accessed. And then the other thing to look at is rendering lists. So in React, we just do a map over that list and then render out this custom ImageLoader component for each image. But in SolidJS, they have a built-in for component where you pass in a list and then it will render something out for each element in that list. So on the surface, both of these implementations look fairly similar, except for like these declarative components and these signal accessors. But the major difference here is how the render cycle actually works. So if you're familiar with React, you know that anytime our state updates, this whole function is going to rerun. This is basically our render function. And if state changes, the whole thing will be reinvoked. We get a virtual DOM tree that gets returned from it. Behind the scenes, there's a virtual DOM diffing algorithm that figures out how to update the page. And then every time state updates happen, this whole cycle happens over and over again. That is React. That's how React works. With Solid, there is no update render cycle like that. Essentially, there are fine-grained state updates. So what that means is all of this code defined at the top here runs once when this component is created. So that's the only time it's going to run, is when this component is created. And then the only parts of our render function that are ever going to re-render or rerun are the places where we access those signals. So these two spots right here are the only subtrees that are going to ever need to recalculate, re-render based on these state changes. And that's kind of a beautiful thing, because you don't have to worry about all of this code up here running again. And you know that the only spots that are going to update or re-render are the places where these signals are accessed. So now let's take a look at that ImageLoader component here inside of React. I'll remind you how the app works. Basically, you search for something, hits the API, and then we lazy load these images. So they start off as gray boxes, then they load a low resolution version of the image, and then they load a high resolution version of the image. So if we look at the code, we have an ImageLoader component. It takes in this photo object. And if we look at the type, this is just the API response. It has things like width and height, and then also this SRC attribute, which also has a bunch of URLs that we can use. But we have one state variable, the image SRC itself. So the image SRC starts off as the empty string, and then we load it here on the image that we're rendering out. And then when the element comes into view, we set it to the small SRC, and then load the large SRC behind the scenes. And then when the large SRC is loaded, we set it to that. And we're doing this with a use effect. So we have a ref to this image here, so we can keep track of when it comes into view. And so this use effect will rerun anytime that photo prop changes or that image ref changes. And inside of here, we have our load image function. We define our intersection observer, which is how we can determine when it comes into view. And we grab that ref here. So if we have a value there for the ref of the image, we observe it using that observer. And if this component ever re-renders this, or this use effect ever needs to rerun, we need to disconnect that observer so that way we don't have a memory leak. Now, inside the intersection observer, we first set the image SRC to small. We then load the large image and stop observing the intersection of this element. And then load image is fairly simple. It loads that large image behind the scenes. And once it's loaded, it sets the large image URL. Now, the one thing I want you to pay attention to here in this React component is the use effect. This is one of the major differences we're going to see with SolidJS is we don't have to define this use effect. And the way that we access the ref is a little bit different as well. So let's take a look at Solid. You can see we have a signal here for that image SRC, and then the render looks fairly similar. But you can see that we're accessing that signal right here on the SRC attribute. Now, for the ref, we can just pass in a callback and get access to it. And to me, this is one of the beautiful things about being able to define all of these things at the top level is that everything is in scope, right? So because all this code's up here is only going to run once when the component is created, I don't have to think about like a use effect or think about how I'm going to access all of these variables. I can literally define my intersection observer at the top level here and then use it right when I get access to that underlying DOM element. So right here, we're just saying observer.observe. I don't have to worry about passing it into a use effect or anything like that. The code is exactly the same. So when it comes into view, set the image SRC, But you'll note again, whenever you set that signal, this whole function doesn't rerun. Literally all that happens is this src attribute gets updated. We then load the src image there. And then finally, we have a cleanup function. So onCleanup is provided by SolidJS. And in here, we're just disconnecting that observer so we don't run into any memory leaks. Now, for me, this is really where things started to click for Solid, because there have been so many times where I'm working in a React component and I have to jump through so many hoops to get all of my variables in the right spot to like be able to use them within a use effect. And then if I have multiple dependent variables, sometimes I have multiple effects. For really complex codes, it starts to get out of hand really fast. But Solid really simplifies that model. So we don't have to think about this update cycle and keeping track of all this stuff. We can just, in a way, treat it like vanilla JavaScript, where we just define things one time and then use them when we need them. So this is definitely one of the things I like about SolidJS as well. Now, if you want to learn more about Solid, definitely dive into their docs. I just scratched the surface, and they have a tutorial. You can dive deeper. And one of the things I'll also note is that signals don't have to be defined inside of a component. So when you're in React, things like useState and useEffect, you can only ever use those inside of a component, and there's lots of rules around how you use them. They can't be conditional and stuff like that. With signals, they can be defined anywhere. You could literally define this in a separate file, import it into any component, and it's still going to work. So it's pretty slick. Definitely check out their docs and their tutorial if you want to dive deeper into SolidJS. So that was a comparison of SolidJS and React. Now let's get to the main event, and probably while you're here, let's take a look at SolidStart versus Next.js. So we're going to do this by taking a look at a Hacker News clone. So whenever you generate a Solid application, it gives you the option of generating Hacker News. And so that's what we're going to look at. And I just recreated the exact same app with Next.js so we can compare and contrast the two. So the app has a few different pages. We can go to the top news here, and it's also paginated. So we can go to page 2, page 3, etc. We can also sort by new. We can look at show Hacker News, ask Hacker News, and jobs. And each one of these pages behaves in the same way. We also have a user page, and then also the story page, which lists out all of the comments. And that's pretty much it. So we have this app in both Solid. It behaves exactly the same way. And then over here in Next.js. So first, let's take a look at how things are set up here inside of Next.js. We have this layout.tsx file. This is kind of our entry point and top level. We have our nav component brought in, and we also have a suspense boundary. So this shows loading whenever there is a page that is in the process of loading. Now, the top level page actually has a dynamic route. So when I'm on the home page here, you can see there's nothing in the URL, but if I go to page 2, it's actually top. And so that's what this dynamic param is, stories. By default, it's undefined, so we default to top. But then on any other page, it could also be set to like new or show or ask. And so that's why we have this dynamic route segment here. Now in Next.js, if you're using app router, every route has a folder with params and the route path. And then inside of that folder is a page.tsx that actually defines that page. And so this is our top level page here inside of Next.js. We have some props. So we're looking at that param stories, which, like I said, is either going to be top, new, show, ask, or job. And then we also have our search params, which might have a page number. We're grabbing both of those values, setting a default if it isn't already set. And so this is a React server component. So we're calling our API, which is going to give us back that list of stories, and then we render them out. So now let's take a look and see how things are set up inside of SolidStart. And one of the things to know about SolidStart is by design, it is very modular. So I highly recommend check out that talk from Ryan, because he talks about why it's modular and basically how he came up with this structure. But it's cool to see that all the parts and pieces you need for a meta framework are kind of piecemeal, right? So you have something that's for the data layer. You have something that's used for bundling in the server runtime. You have something that's used for routing, but by design, you could pick and choose these items. So if for whatever reason you don't like how these work, you could implement your own, or eventually there will be some that pop up in the ecosystem that you can start to build your own stack from as well. And one of the main pieces here is Vinci, which is a bundler and server runtime. So if we look at the package.json for SolidStart, you can see that it uses Vinci as its dev server. So there isn't like a solid CLI or anything like that. It's using Vinci. And that's a good thing, because Vinci itself is built on top of Vite and Nitro. But what's cool is it's basically a framework for building frameworks. So you can see in their docs that they actually have examples of React server components or server-side rendering. And so this basically allows you to do the kinds of things that you get with Next.js, but you can kind of like build your own stack with it if you're using React. But you can use it with other frameworks as well. And so that's one of the coolest things about SolidStart is it basically takes all of these pieces to assemble a meta framework. But in the future, you could swap out one of these pieces if you ever need to, or implement your own if you have better ideas about how this kind of stuff should be done. So that's one of the really cool parts. Now let's take a look at the top level entry point. We're going to look at the entry server here. This basically starts up the server, and it is the shell of the application. We then also have a client entry point. This essentially just mounts it to the DOM. And then we have our app.tsx. Now here is where we have our router. And one of the other cool things to see is this is literally the only spot in our entire code base where we are importing from SolidJS/start. Everywhere else where we import something is either from the router or the SolidJS framework itself. So this is literally the only spot that SolidStart actually appears, and it's for file routing. So if you take a look at how things are set up here, we have this routes folder, and then each page is its own file inside of this routes folder. But the way we're mounting that into our application is with this file routes component. So this gets defined right here, and that essentially brings in all of those file routes. But this is a declarative router, so you could add additional routes that aren't file routes on top of this. You also could not use that at all. You could implement your own file router if you really wanted to. The other aspect of this is you'll see that we don't have to do page.tsx, right? So it uses top-level routes. And there are reasons why you might like the idea of having a folder with a page.tsx inside of it like you do with Next.js. But if you really do like that, you could implement your own router. You could build your own file routes router here that actually forces you to use like a page.tsx or something like that. And so that's one of the cool things about Solid is how pluggable it is. Now at the top level here, you'll see that we are bringing in our nav component, and then we also have a suspense boundary. So suspense works very similar to how it works in React. Essentially, if its children are async components, it's going to show this fallback here before it loads those components in. Now our top level entry point is this stories component here. And again, it's top level, and stories by default could be undefined, and that just means we're loading the home page. Otherwise, we will pull in the specific story type like top, new, show, or ask. Now you'll see that this component has a route object with a load function. Essentially, this assists with server-side rendering and loading that data on the server. But the main part where we're actually loading data in here is this create async function. And so create async actually comes from Solid Router. And this is what gives us either server-side rendering or client-side rendering, and also streaming of the data. So get stories is our function that actually calls the API. And in this case, it's dependent on both the type and the page. Now, one interesting thing you'll see here is we've actually defined these as functions. And that's because of this mental model of this codes is only going to run once when that component is created. And so if we want to re-access these values, we would need to reevaluate that code, which is why we've defined these as essentially like getter functions. So that way, if the type changes, this is going to rerun. If the page changes, this is going to rerun. But let's actually talk about the data loading here, because this is one of the cool things about Solid as well. So in Next.js, our pages here are React server components. So by default, any page you have is a server component. And the only way you can make it a client component is if you explicitly say use client on that component. Now to see what's happening here, we can take a look at the Next.js app. And basically, as I start to browse around, it does use client-side rendering. So there isn't a full page re-render here. You can see that it's actually using an RST request when I click around to like users and stories and stuff like that. And also if we take a look at the DOM, so you'll notice here as I navigate around, it's just updating the DOM directly, right? This isn't a full page refresh. So we still technically are getting like server-side render on the initial page load, and then it's doing client rendering after that. But mainly what I'm talking about is the actual request to the API, right? Because as I navigate around, these aren't calling the Hacker News API directly, it's calling my backend, right? And so this is mainly what I mean here by we would have to rewrite this component. Basically, we would need to, again, have a client component, and then that client component could have like a fetch inside of it that actually calls the API. Check this out inside of SolidJS. So get stories, if we actually take a look at how this is implemented, this is just a standalone function that has use server on it. And what that means is this code will only ever run on the server. And in this case, we're actually calling the Hacker News API from here. So what that means is if we look at how the data is loading inside of Solid, it's doing a similar thing in that it's actually making requests to our server to load that data. But check this out. All I have to do is comment out this use server right here. And now this fetch to this API will run directly on the client. So now that we've commented out that use server, you can already see it happening here. So instead of making those calls to the server, it's calling the Hacker News API directly. So for me, this is this is a beautiful mental model for how to actually work with data loading. Is if you want that code to run on the server, just put use server inside of it. It's not bound to specific types of files. Literally, if this use server directive is inside of a function, that function is always going to run on the server, and the solid router is going to set it up so that those are RPC calls by default. And right now we have this defined in a separate module, but the way to think about this is we could do this in line, right? I could literally have this component here. I could have a little function. All it has to do is say use server, and we can make a fetch. And now this little piece of code right here is always going to run on the server. And so to me, this is another beautiful thing about SolidStart is I don't have to jump around between server-specific components and client-specific components. I can just write my components like I'm used to in SolidJS, and then the solid router and create async are kind of taking care of making sure that these things only live or run on the server if they need to. Now, other than that, most of the differences you'll see in the two apps are similar to what I showed earlier. So like inside of Solid, you have like show and for components and things like that. But another thing to look at is prefetching and preloading. So as I navigate around the UI, if I'm going to click on like the user or the comments, you'll see that with Next.js, by default, as I click around, it's not going to make a request to those items until I've actually clicked on them and they're actually loading. Now, if we look at the codes for Next.js, I am using this link component provided by Next.js, and that's basically what is able to give us client-side rendering, right? So as I click around, these aren't full page refreshes. Next.js is smart enough to basically load that data over RSC and then re-render the page here, but we don't get preloading by default. So check out what happens inside of SolidJS. As I just hover over these links, it is basically optimistically fetching the data that's required for them. Now, you might say, well, I don't want that. There's a way to disable it, but it's pretty slick that this happens just by default. And so now that I've kind of like hovered over all of these links, the pages load instantly because it's basically already loaded that data behind the scenes. Now, you could do the same thing in Next.js. I do think you'd have to get a little more manual with it. Like you would have to have some like on hover events to make sure that you're pre-caching and preloading that data. But it's pretty slick that literally all we need in SolidJS is just a link to that page, and it automatically handles prefetching of that data. You can see here, these are just anchor tags to the next page, and then inside the story component, links to the comments in the user. Those are also anchor tags. Now, let's take a look at the codes for the story page that renders out all of the comments here. So if we look inside of Next.js, we have this stories folder, and then a nested bracket ID folder, and then the page.tsx folder. And it's pretty straightforward, right? So we grab the story. This is a React server component, so it's calling the API on the server. And then if there was an error, don't show it. If there wasn't an error, kind of just render everything out. But this is the point where I will complain about SolidStart. So if we look at how things are done in Solid, the template is a little harder to look at, and that's because of these signal accessors everywhere, right? So this is a signal that corresponds to the story that got loaded in, but you'll notice everywhere we access it, we have to invoke it, right? And so this does start to get cumbersome, right? So if you have a component with these accessors all over the place, it's going to get hard to look at. I almost prefer if they had something like Svelte5 or like Vue, where you can do signal.value. That might be easier to look at. The other thing is we're also combining this with the not null assertion of TypeScript, so that makes it even harder to look at. You can see inside of Next.js, I kind of just already made an assertion here that it's not going to be null, so we don't have that all over the place. We could clean it up, but I will say this is one of the things that isn't as ideal about Solid, is it takes some getting used to, and I'm not sure how I feel looking at a component that has these signal accessors all over the place. So that's it for this first look at SolidStart version 1.0. And you might be thinking, should I use SolidStart today? Should I drop everything? Should I stop using Next.js and start using SolidStart? It depends. It definitely depends. I'll say that everyone's situation is different, right? So if you're watching this and you are more of a junior dev or a beginner, maybe you're trying to find a job, or maybe you're already working a job with like React and Next.js, it probably doesn't make sense to drop everything and start using SolidStart, or doesn't make sense to just like rewrite your app in SolidStart. Because the jobs right now are in Next.js and React, because that's what people are using. I will say, though, if you are a decision maker, right? So if you are a team lead, or maybe you're the lead technical person at your company that gets to make more technical decisions, I would say you can start to consider SolidStart whenever you're choosing the tech stack for your next application, right? I wouldn't recommend people go out and just rewrite their whole app with SolidStart, because that's a lot of work, and you're probably already invested in Next.js and their stack and everything else. But if you like what you've seen, I definitely recommend exploring it, right? Because there's other aspects that I haven't touched on, things that maybe I glossed over. So I would say, if this interests you, dive deeper, build something with it, and really see for yourself if it is something that you like and something you would want to build your apps with. Now, the other thing I'm excited about is this aspect of a pluggable architecture, because with this, basically, Ryan and the Solid team have kind of released these ideas out into the world. And I think we're going to start to see new competitors to Next.js, right? So I talked about how Vinci doesn't have to be specifically Solid. You can use it with React. You could use it with Vue or anything else. Basically, anything that's supported by Vite, you can make it work with Vinci. And so what that means is we are going to see competitors to Next.js that are built on top of Vinci, right? So basically, it's going to be a stack that looks like this, but instead of Solid, it's React, right? And that is also going to be interesting to see, because Next.js definitely needs some competitors. There are some really cool ideas here that Next.js will probably steal, but if they can't because of technical limitations or backwards compatibility and stuff like that, it would be really cool if a new framework came along that still used React, which people are used to, but is kind of like this pluggable architecture, which is pretty slick. So that's all I have for you in this video. Thank you very much for watching. All of the code that I showed is open source, so check the links in the description if you want to dive deeper into the codes. Also, let me know if you have any questions about the code that I showed, or maybe something that I glossed over. I'd love to talk about it in the comments. And also, I don't normally say this, but subscribe. If you like what you see, we'd love your sub here on the Syntax channel. Also, turn on that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one.